Good evening. My name is Celeste Blue, and on behalf of the Gulf Coast Reads Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our live talk with Fisherman and the Dragon author, Kirk Wallace Johnson. Gulf Coast Reads on the Same Page is an annual reading initiative focused on promoting the simultaneous reading or listening to a selected title by those living along the upper Texas Gulf Coast. Each year, the Gulf Coast Reads Committee, comprised of librarians and literary partners, collaboratively selects a title that has broad appeal to adults in our communities. Our goal is to encourage our communities to read the same title during the month of October in order to encourage readers to come together in discussions about it in classrooms and in libraries throughout the region. To find out more about the initiative, please visit gulfcoastreads.org. Here to tell us more about the committee's 2023 selection, The Fisherman and the Dragon, is our author, Kirk Wallace Johnson, and our friend and moderator, Lise Olsen. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Celeste. It's an honor to be here with Kirk and all of our friends, who many of whom are probably reading or have read The Fisherman and the Dragon, Fear, Greed, and a Fight for Justice on the Gulf Coast. That's Kirk's latest book. It is, of course, a Gulf Coast Reads selection. It was also the winner of the Carr P. Collins Award by the Texas Institute of Letters, chosen as one of the best books of last year by the Texas Observer. And he also has written another fabulous book. If you get done with this one, you still want to read more. It's called The Feather Thief. Beauty, Obsession, and the Natural History Heist of the Century. So you have another book about both about the environment and about true crime combo. His first book, though, is about his work, which he did for some years for the USAID, working in Fallujah. He met many of the Iraqis who were helping translate for troops. When he came back to the United States, he created the List Project to help resettle Iraqi allies and helped many of those people find safe haven in the United States. I know you weren't able to save all of them, but you did a lot of amazing work. So his third book is about that. To Be a Friend is Fatal, the fight to save the Iraqis, America left behind. I am thrilled to be here tonight. This book is a fascinating read, especially for those of us who live in Harris County. Maybe some of us do not remember the events of 1979 and 1980 that Kirk describes so incredibly well in his book. But there are events that I think are really relevant today, and we're going to be talking about tonight. I want to seg a little bit, though, to some personal things about Kirk. In addition to doing all these amazing things as an author and activist, he is also a fly fisherman, which has led him to both of his first two books. And he tells me that he was seeking solace fly fishing after his father's death when he heard a particular song. So can you tell the story about how you decided to write this book and that song?
Sure. And first off, I just want to say thank you, Lisa, for doing this with me, but also thanks to Celeste and to the whole Gulf Coast Reads program, to the community. There's a lot of frustrating, challenging, bleak moments when you're an author where you wonder whether anyone's going to read what you're writing and whether this is all worth it. And so the opportunity to get to talk with readers, this sort of replenishes the reservoir for me. So I'm really grateful and honored to be here. I get asked very frequently how I find my stories, and I never have a good answer because it always seems to be by accident. This one in particular, on December 3rd of 2018, so we're just coming up on five years now, my dad passed away after a very quick battle with cancer. He the same week that he retired, celebrated this 50th wedding anniversary with my mom, and the same week that they kind of started a long planned addition to their home, my dad got a stage 4 cancer diagnosis that was spurred in part by his exposure to Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. He was 101st Airborne. And I had been going back and forth between California and Illinois, but I wasn't home with him the day he died. And I was here in Los Angeles, and I said to my wife, it just feels kind of strange to be sitting around at home like it's a normal day. And I felt this really overwhelming urge to go fishing. My dad taught me how to fish, and I thought that it would be a way to kind of, I don't know, start the grieving process with him. And so I threw my fly fishing gear and headed up to the southern Sierra Nevadas to go fishing. And I had the radio on along the way, but I wasn't really paying attention to it until this song came on. It was a Springsteen song called Galveston Bay. And in it, Springsteen sings about a young man, a young Vietnamese man who is starting up a new life in Galveston after having to flee after the fall of Saigon. And he's kind of starting things up, and before he knows it, he's got the Ku Klux Klan after him. And the song kind of just came and went very quickly, but I didn't know what Springsteen was talking about. It seemed like an awfully elaborate setup for a song, if it was all fictional. I was completely ignorant. I didn't know of the Vietnamese community in Houston. I didn't know very much about the Klan. But for the next few weeks, the song kept popping back up in my mind. And when I finally started doing just a little bit of research, I realized, like, not only was it true, but that no one really seems to have written anything on it. And that led to a kind of progression of, I mean, I'm Swedish by blood, so I have the worst case, scenario planning in my mind. But I thought, well, okay, there's probably no good archives. The court records are probably destroyed. Anyone who lived through it has probably since passed away. But steadily, as I started digging, I started finding not just one, but the vast majority of people that lived through this, and getting them to talk with me. I had a lot of luck through the Freedom of Information Act and springing, thousands of pages of FBI documents. I flew down to Alabama to get, probably 10,000 pages of court records that have since, that otherwise I would not have been able to get. And before I knew it, I was going down to Texas. Strangely, I owe this book to Bruce, which was, I don't think I'll find another book through him, but that he's the reason why this one exists. That was a long answer to your question.
So we were going to play a little bit of the song, but I'll just read a lyric or two. One humid Texas night, there were 3 shadows on the harbor, come to burn the Vietnamese boats into the sea. When you start reading Kirk's book, and we're going to have him read a little bit of it, one of the things he does really well is he recreates Houston in the 70s. Those of you who were here, I was not here in the late 70s, but I heard about it. Some of you remember that there was a XXX theater in Pasadena that you could go by, and if you were lucky or unlucky, see a few scenes as you went by on the road. In those days, there was a radio station that called themselves the Kickers, but it was a little bit more like the KKKers. There was a KKK headquarters on Red Bluff Road. And a lot of this, I think we remember more, Texans tend to remember more Lee Harvey Oswald, the KKK maybe of the 20s, 30s, 40s, the Dallas KKK. But I think a lot of Houstonians have sort of forgotten that there was a very big conflict in Kemah, of all places, Kemah and Seabrook in 1979-80. And the book opens with a scene of a very busy fishing harbor with lots of boats. Today we've got the Kemah Boardwalk, but then there were way more fishing boats, both owned by white fishermen and Vietnamese fishermen. And I thought that for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, I think it's really a great way to start, just to have Kirk read a little bit from the opening, because it takes you right back there and puts you in that harbor on that day.
Sure, I'm happy to. And if I start coughing, please forgive me. Ever since my toddlers went back to school, like there's just been this soup of all kinds of illnesses going around. So I'm just getting over it, but bear with me. And so this actually takes place in March of 1981.
If you want to show the picture of the boat, that boat is from the scene he's going to read about. There we go. That's great.
Excuse me. The navy gray paint of the trawler was faded and chipped, spattered with the excrement of gulls that jostled and shrieked overhead when the catch was still good. The Cherry Betty's engine was ancient, coughing up black diesel fumes as the boat motored slowly down the channel toward the dark water of Galveston Bay. Blue, rainless sky that March morning, a perfect day for a ride. On the southern side of the narrow channel, which separated the fishing towns of Seabrook and Kemah, a Vietnamese fisherman was sitting in his living room with a friend, making plans for the upcoming season of shrimping. Their conversation was interrupted by the sight of a trawler, overloaded with passengers, growling past. They shot to their feet and ran to the window. Most of those on board were dressed in white robes with rifles slung over their shoulders. There was a cannon on the stern. Something was hanging from one of the outriggers. "What's that?" the Vietnamese fisherman asked his friend nervously. "Is that a sack of shrimp?" David Collins grinned as he piloted the Cherry Betty ahead. Earlier that morning, soon after the Grand Dragon of the Texas Knights of the Ku Klux Klan had given them the go-ahead, the boat was swarming with passengers, some in hoods, other in army fatigues and black Ku Klux Klan Realm of Texas t-shirts. The Confederate flag hanging from the boat's mast whipped in the wind as they passed the boatyard that white fishermen of Galveston Bay had come to refer to as Saigon Harbor. The drawbridge connecting Seabrook and Kemah lowered, blocking their forward progress. Collins threw the engine in neutral and the boat drifted alongside the Kemah boardwalk, which was thronged with tourists and locals. John Van Beekum, a photojournalist for the Houston Chronicle, was on his day off, tucking into a shrimp sandwich when he caught sight of the Klan boat. He sprinted to his car, praying that he had enough film in his camera and that he could get back before it disappeared. Off on the horizon, a massive oil tanker churned through the heart of the bay toward one of the refineries, clotting the bay with smokestacks, chemical tanks, and hundreds of miles of underwater pipeline. It was only recently that the latest tanker collision, which had spilled millions of gallons of crude to the seabed and caused a months-long fire that turned the sky over Galveston Bay black, was finally extinguished with a foamy soup of chemicals. Word was spreading quickly. The owner of Saigon Harbor, a white transplant from Illinois, was storming the docks, shouting at Vietnamese fishermen to get off their boats and go hide at home. Some wanted to stay with guns to protect their trawlers. When the drawbridge raised, Collins shifted into gear and the Cherry Betty resumed its trip. The Klansmen, standing along the bow, their arms folded below the blood-drop cross symbol on their robes, were making it difficult to see. But he knew the channel well. He and his brother had been shrimping here ever since they moved from Florida as teenagers. Van Beekum raced back to the boardwalk with his camera just in time to snap dozens of pictures. As those on board flashed Sig Heil salutes and mugged for the camera, most on the boardwalk seemed amused. Just then, another young man, who once fought for the South Vietnamese Navy, was about to fire up the engine of the beat-up shrimp boat he'd just bought. Ever since arriving in Texas as a refugee 5 years earlier, after the collapse of his country, he'd been saving every penny he earned assembling car radios in Houston in order to break into fishing. He was in a triumphant mood, about to take it out for the first time when the Cherry Betty skulked past. He looked up, wide-eyed. It looked as though there was a body hanging from the noose off the outrigger, its boots swaying 4 feet above the deck. When Collins cleared the channel, he steered the Cherry Betty north, hugging close to the shoreline. As someone loaded a shell into the cannon, the Klan boat approached the dock jutting out from the home of the man who had become the greatest obstacle to their plans. He was a highly decorated South Vietnamese colonel who had spent the past 2 decades in battle. Ever since arriving in Texas, he'd become the leader of the Vietnamese shrimpers of Galveston Bay. If the Klan could drive him from the coast, the rest might follow suit, and the white fishermen would have the waters to themselves again.
So that sets up this conflict that plays out in the book in really, really surprising ways. There's, in fact, a series of very dramatic scenes, a lot of different and both villains and not so villainous villains, and very complex heroes and heroines that appear in all parts of Texas. This conflict that played out in 1980, which is the pivotal event of the book, actually has its roots a little bit further south in Seadrift. And so I want to go down there for a minute because the book then follows the story of how a white fisherman, prior to this Klan boat materializing, is very angry. He's a crabber, actually. He's very angry at Vietnamese crabbers poaching on what he thinks is his territory. There's a number of disputes that some of which his young daughter witnesses, and he ends up dying. He ends up being killed after threatening the lives of some of the Vietnamese. I don't want to have too many spoilers here, but that's the very beginning of the book too. There's a lot of action in the book. And what I think is one of the things that I think is so incredible about this book is that Kirk does not paint the men in the white suits as just stick figures. He is able to interview their families. He interviews wives, children, tries to dig into the motivations of what would make a fisherman do something like this. And those reasons are very complicated. So when you talk about Billy Joe Applin, who's the fisherman, the crabber who is killed towards the beginning of the book in what turns out to be an act of self-defense by young Vietnamese fishermen, you are able to, I think, pretty incredibly get some insights into him by interviewing his daughter and his wife. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you did that. How did you meet some of these people and get to know some of their stories?
Sure. Well, I mean, it was very important to me. I think we have a hard time. Americans have a hard time talking about race, about racism. We don't know if we're using the right words. We don't know if we're generalizing. And I had a very clear personal objective when I was writing this, that if I just tried to depict people in sort of as you said, stick figures or in a cartoonish way, it's not going to challenge anybody. It's not going to, and I didn't have any ambitions to excuse any of the behavior in this book, because a lot of what happened along this coastline was abhorrent. It was unforgivable. I mean, people's homes were burnt, their boats were burned to the ground, they were given death threats. And as you said, one of the main white crabbers lost his life in this conflict. Ultimately, an all-white jury concluded that the young Vietnamese man that killed him did so on lawful grounds of self-defense, as you said. But Billy Joe didn't start off angry at Vietnamese. He didn't start off angry at the world. This was the late 70s for those that weren't alive back then, and certainly for those who weren't fishing back then. It was like a kind of a freakish series of bad pressures, of stagflation, of rising fuel prices, where people would spend their whole days out in the bays trying to catch shrimp, and they wouldn't even cover the cost of their fuel. There were the largest, until the BP spill, the largest peacetime oil spill in world history was on the Texas Gulf Coast in 1979, just a few months before, or literally, I think 1 or 2 months before.
It was in Mexico in the Ixtac oil spill that it
Exactly.
came up the Texas Gulf Coast.
Exactly, and that took over a year, I think, for them to finally cap that well. And so, shrimpers and crabbers, none of them were, none of them were getting rich before all of this, but their way of life was already threatened by these forces that were much larger than them. And then Saigon falls after a pretty calamitous war, and Texas, and specifically the Houston area and Galveston Bay, becomes home to the second largest number of Vietnamese refugees. Who I always feel like I have to say this to people, but no one wants to become a refugee. So, as I think grateful as many of the Vietnamese were back then to be given a safe haven, every single refugee I've spoken to would have given anything to be able to stay back in the country where their parents are buried and where they're from. But they were brought here legally, and they started trying to rebuild their lives in this country. And in Texas, since many of the Vietnamese had been fishermen back home before the war, they saw this opportunity to start up as fishermen. And I will say, I talked to a lot of white fishermen who were, pretty giddy that the Vietnamese were there at first, because they were able to unload these decrepit, rusting, carcasses of boats to the Vietnamese, oftentimes at 5 or 7 times the true value. And they thought they were playing the Vietnamese for suckers. But over the subsequent few years, the Vietnamese, found efficiencies. They used family members as deckhands, which is something that white fishermen don't often do. So they could keep that extra percentage in the family. They often went out fishing in bad weather. The shrimpers, when they got into shrimping, a lot of I'm a neophyte compared to any Texan shrimper, but a lot of times when you come back after, when you've got your catch, you bring it to a fish house and you get an average of small, medium, large, and jumbo. The Vietnamese figured that there might be a little bit more money to be made, that maybe they should be getting a little bit more because there's more jumbos than there are smalls, for example. And so one boat would tow a couple other boats while the other boats were sorting their catch on the way back into the harbors and into the bay, so that they could actually get a more precise accounting for what they caught. And in these ways, in all these different ways, they started becoming a really effective fishing force. Did they make mistakes? No question. Did they violate the unwritten rules of the bay? Yes, many of them didn't know about the rules of the bay, but I have yet to talk to a white shrimper that didn't also admit to violating the same rules when it benefited them. But the tension started kind of boiling between these two groups, or I would say more amongst the white Texans who had kind of held sway over this industry. But for Billy Joe, it's so important that people understand that. I mean, he had a real string of bad luck. He had been a shrimper. He lost his boat when it snagged on something in the bottom of one of the seabeds and it sunk, and he got knocked back down to crabbing. He kept pulling up mutated crabs in his nets or in his traps, and he tried in the 70s to rally his fellow fishermen into supporting a kind of legal action against the chemical plants along the coastline, but he got nowhere with it. And so I can't, put myself in his mind back then, but I think what happened is what a lot of the fishermen told me was that there were a lot of things we couldn't control, but the Vietnamese, we could get our hands around them. There was a problem we could solve. And so all of this boiled over one day when a young Vietnamese man dropped his traps too close to Billy Joe, and Billy Joe kind of just snapped and smashed his. He pulled up this Vietnamese man's traps, and he, crushed them and threw them in a pile to the bottom of the bed. And the Vietnamese got angry about that. There was a nasty confrontation out on the water about an hour later, where several Vietnamese boats encircled Billy Joe and his family who were on board, terrifying them. The Vietnamese, several of them had their traps stolen or smashed, and so they felt justified in basically trying to say, cut it out, stop this. But that confrontation out on the bays, basically, something switched in Billy Joe, and then in the subsequent 4 or 6 weeks, every time he saw this young Vietnamese man in town, he told him he was going to kill him. He he slashed his tires. He raised a rifle at him at one point, and aimed it at him. And this all boiled over one night down by the docks in Seadrift. Billy Joe started assaulting this young man, drew a knife and cut him. The young man fled, went back to his trailer, got a revolver, and then went back because his other brother was down by the boat still, and he was worried that his other brother was going to be in danger. And when he got back, Billy Joe resumed this attack, and Sao, this young Vietnamese man, drew his pistol and shot him. Now, I had heard that story very early on when I was reporting this, but I always thought it was a kind of unconnected, some other sad tragedy that happened a couple of years before that Klan boat patrol that we just talked about. But it actually, in the way I describe it in the book, it actually is kind of the fuse that led to this greater and greater conflagration that eventually led much of the coast to be something like a powder keg. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't want to keep rambling, but it's
no. I mean, what we were talking about, you're certainly presenting Billy in his complexity, and you present him as an angry fisherman. You do not present him initially as a KKK member, but what you learn on page 64 of the book is that his daughter tells you, that her dad had, in fact, organized at least one small Klan meeting down in Seadrift and had a robe. And I thought that was kind of incredible that she would tell you about that.
Yeah, sorry. He had been to, I don't think he organized it. He had been to
he attended one.
He had taken her to his family, to a Klan meeting, but he had been a member. And for so long, people, so many of my interviews in the first year or so of this investigation, I kept asking, why did the Ku Klux Klan get involved after Billy Joe was killed? No one seemed to have an answer, but very shortly after Sao Van Nguyen was acquitted by an all-white jury, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas announced that there had been all kinds of improprieties in the trial, and that he was going to he was going to come on a fact-finding tour to Seadrift to find out what went wrong. And as soon as he did that, he had Walter Cronkite following his every move. And Seadrift was, this tiny town of 700 people at the time, was overrun with national news crews and international news crews.
Still is probably not very much bigger than that, right? I mean, Seadrift is tiny.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just there not too long ago. And it's important to understand that.
Well, what I was asking you, though, is how did you get her to tell you that story? Do you not want to reveal your secrets? Because she tells you Beth never told anyone what she knew. If she had, she might have talked about the time her dad took them to their first Klan rally over a year before he was killed. She remembered the fish fry, angry speeches, the tense drive back.
Hmm.
And she tells you about the night that the McAlpins put Billy Joe's Ku Klux Klan robe into that grill and burned it up.
Right.
Tell me about how you got her to tell you those things. I mean, that's hard things to remember about your dad who was murdered.
It is hard. And I think for those that have seen Tim Tsai's documentary, Sea Drift, she is a central character in that film. And I think she's really admirably trying to understand what happened and why her dad wasn't there anymore. It's a unimaginable tragedy for a 14-year-old. I think she was 13 or 14 when this happened. With all of these investigations, but especially with this book, I was very upfront with everyone that I spoke about that right now I just want to understand what happened. There's so much conflicting accounts. There's so many, even the local coverage back then, there were sort of irreconcilable statements made in the space of a single article. And so a lot of what I always do is just show up. I plunk a voice recorder in front of whoever I'm speaking with, and we just talk.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my first interview with Billy Joe's daughter, I was just flipping through. I had a lot of photos from the 1981 event from when the Klan did the boat patrol. And one of the main kind of rabble rousers up in Seabrook and Kemah in 81 was a guy by the name of Gene Fisher. And she kind of groaned when she saw that picture, and she goes, "Oh, not him." And I said, "Well, you know him?" And she goes, "Yeah, my mom dated him, some years after my dad died." And so that was just a complete accident, but it directly now links the events of 1979 and Sea Drift and what happened in Seabrook 2 years later. She told me in the course of multiple interviews about her dad having joined the Klan. He was not some lifelong Klansman. I think there was some lack of clarity about whether it was maybe a year prior or 2 years prior to his death that he had joined. But it was such an important revelation that I also wanted to hear it from Billy Joe's widow. And so, his daughter could make no promises, but I wrote her a letter and did my best to lay out my case for why it would be good to talk. And then I went down to Texas and did an interview with the two of them on the record. And that's how we got into it. But, it's not a pleasant memory, but it's also, I don't start the book by saying, "Here's Billy Joe, here's your Klansman, central casting."
No.
You don't find out about it until the very end, because I wanted the reader to understand who this guy was. And then, yes, there is a bombshell that reveals this mystery of why Louis Beam, the Grand Dragon of the Klan, was so invested in finding out what happened, because this was one of his own men that had been killed. So, but every one of these stories, unfolds in different ways. There's other sources that, almost before I could even sit down and get the tape recorder going, people were almost excitedly telling me some of the criminal activity that
Maybe just enough time had passed, that they had to be able to process it. The people who they didn't want to know were gone, maybe their mothers, or I don't know. I think the passage of time maybe helped a little bit. Do you think?
I also think there's myriad reasons. I think some were kind of proud of what they did. Certainly the ones who set fire to homes or boats, they were all very keenly aware of what the statute of limitations were governing arson in Texas. There were some that, I'm trying to think now, but at least two of the main characters of the book passed away not long after I spoke.
One of them admitted to committing multiple insurance fraud, I think, arsons, right?
Yeah. That was the other fun thing. Like I make no, I don't try to fake it. Like, I'm obviously not a Texan, but there were so many just huge, big, colorful Texan stories that I had to kind of there were some that were so kind of darkly funny and shocking that they were like almost distracting from the narrative, and I couldn't put them in. But yes, there's a lot of insurance fraud happening in this book. Like, it's almost like a side hobby.
There were a lot of stories, but that's the other thing that's really fun about this book is there's a lot of very big, colorful characters, and we've spent some time talking about Billy Joe. He is actually at the beginning of the book, but you very quickly you meet another person in Seadrift who becomes what you say is sort of the light in the book. She's a person that may be familiar to some Texans. Her name is Diane Wilson, and she most recently, I think, has become really well known for having sued Formosa Plastics successfully over dumping tons of nurdles into a bay that was already contaminated by another company, but certainly didn't need all those nurdles. And she won that lawsuit. It's been a rare environmental victory. But she's a former shrimper, person who has spent her life on the water and is a really well-known activist and also an author in her own right. But you see her in a way as somebody who is kind of parallel to Billy Joe in one way, in that they're both looking around at some point and realizing the enemy is not necessarily the other fishermen, although Diane comes to it, I think, more strongly sooner. It is the big polluters where you've got these mutated fish and things like that. So tell me a little bit about how you met Diane and why you decided that was really the biggest conflict, because the big conflict in the book, appears to be, white fishermen against Vietnamese fishermen, but you suddenly shift in your book to something else, which is this bigger conflict between the corporate polluters, the pollution, and the fishermen.
Yeah. So, there was, in every other article that was written about this back in the late 70s and early 80s, you'll see the phrase turf war. And it was always this setup between the whites and the Vietnamese over fishing rights. And when I first heard that Springsteen song and when I first started investigating, that's what I thought the book was going to be about. But at some point, there was this, almost every archival visit that I made and going into all these old newspaper articles, I'd find an article about some turning point in the clash between the whites and the Vietnamese, but there was always some ongoing environmental crisis happening in the bays. There was always a tanker collision. There was always an oil spill. There was always, a plant blowing up or things like that. And I realized, largely through learning more about Diane Wilson, that everyone had been paying attention to the turf war, but no one was paying attention to the turf itself. That this was, by almost all expectations, a doomed way of life, trying to make a living by pulling things up from the bays. Now, Gulf shrimping is a very different thing. These boats that go out for a month at a time. But for a long, long time, for generations, Texas's bay system supported a certain amount of fishermen that could make a living through oystering, through crabbing, through shrimping. But from the 40s onwards, there was this progression of powerful Texans, governors and senators and others, that basically were waving in big industry, saying, don't worry, we've got a few regulations here, and what we do have, we'll give you waivers. And yes, please set up your plants along this pristine coastline here. Set up your petrochemical plants. And over the decades, those plants spread kind of like a cancer. Rivers were impounded. The fresh water from rivers were impounded. The state authorities would then sell that fresh water to the plants, which would run them through these sort of toxic processes. And then they would give those plants discharge permits to discharge that foul water into the bays. And lo and behold, shrimp start mutating, crabs start mutating. You get big spills of mercury and other chemicals, and the ecosystems start collapsing in these bays. And it turns out that there's less and less shrimp and crab coming up in your nets. Now, if you're a shrimper whose dad taught you how to shrimp and whose grandpa taught your dad how to shrimp, you could look at this coastline and see these massive multinational conglomerates, Formosa and Dow and other companies.
Alcoa,
all of them.
Union Carbide.
Exactly. That are hiring you in the off season and you might be getting your health insurance through them, or certainly people in your family are working for them. You could do what Billy Joe did. He tried to do at the beginning and say, hey guys, it sure feels like you're screwing our bays up and our catch up here. Or you look to a frankly small number of Vietnamese fishermen who are there legally and who are just trying to do what you're trying to do, make the best of a bad situation. And literally all of the white male shrimpers that are main characters in my book basically chose the latter. They said it's the Vietnamese fault. Diane Wilson, who's one of the lone female shrimpers along the Texas coast, it's not lost on me that it was a woman that could see clearly here, but she kept saying, she's from Seadrift. She was there the night that Billy Joe was killed. She kept saying to others around her, it's not the Vietnamese, it's the plants. The plants are what are fouling our bays up. And she had this hunch that was ultimately confirmed for her in 1988 or 89, I think is when her campaign started in earnest. But she has been on a decades-long,
war against pollution.
Against plants, a war in which you could see in the book, but it destroys her marriage. It turns her family against her. She's ostracized by her community. She gets death threats. A helicopter hovers and shoots her dog in a very kind of remote part of Seadrift. Someone sabotages her boat. It pushes her to the brink of suicide at one point. And she keeps battling because she's trying to protect the bays and what's in them. And in I think it was December of 2018, she made history as by winning the largest ever settlement under the Clean Water Act in U.S. history against Formosa. She did this through hunger strikes, through incredible sort of grassroots activism and campaigning, and she's still doing it. I mean, in 1 week's time, she's starting another hunger strike along the bay there to protest Formosa and another sort of ecological catastrophe that Formosa is responsible for.
And Kirk's book is really great on Diane, quoting her. She's very funny, very frank. She also has written her own books. I have read her book, An Unreasonable Woman, which is a good description of her. But she never gives up, and I think that gives us a thread of hope in what otherwise is sort of a series of skirmishes and sort of dark events. Although I think throughout your book, you kind of give us some hope that things are going to go well. And though other people talk about, Texans maybe in negative ways, there are plenty of Texans who do the right thing in this book. Very interesting characters. I mean, the fact that the mayor of the town council of Seadrift actually refused to give the KKK permission to protest there. The Vietnamese fishermen who ended up killing, as you said, Billy Joe Applin after this conflict, is acquitted by an all-white jury in Texas. These things happen. These things are happening. So this is all playing out at a time, I think, when most Texans are kind of wishing that the KKK was part of the past. There's the civil rights movements going on. A lot of Texans are ashamed of this, but at the same time, there is a resurgence of the Klan in 1980, which I was unaware of. And part of it is because of a charismatic figure that's also appears in this book, who is not a hero in any way, shape, or form, whose name is Louis Beam. And Louis Beam is, in fact, still alive. He was the Grand Dragon, I guess, of the KKK. He lived in Pasadena. They had, I talked to people who remember this, they had open signs in Pasadena. He was also a prolific killer. He had been a decorated Vietnam veteran. His account in your book, I think he lists he was credited with something like 50 kills. I mean, he was a trained assassin. He was a very dangerous person. At one point, he was training paramilitary groups on federal government property, and that's actually what ends up being, I guess, his downfall. But at this point, in the early part of the book, when this protest is staged, he is the one orchestrating all this behind the scenes. And of course, you talked about, you found a lot of documents that helped you portray him, things in archives, things in the federal court records. I believe you also, it would be interesting, I think, to people to hear how you found a surveillance tape that I believe was in the state archives. Is that right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there was. So, I mean, Louis, as you said, I mean, he has been called the godfather of the alt-right today. The extreme right wing certainly knows who he is. He's also been sort of credited as the kind of sort of ideological origins of the lone wolf attacking strategy among white supremacists. There's endless debate about whether or not his writings had some role in inspiring the Oklahoma City bombings. I'm not able to tell, but he is. This is not. This was not somebody who was just idly, who idly hated minorities or something. I mean, he came back from Vietnam, and there's a great book called great nonfiction account of the role of the Vietnam War in the sort of resurgence of the white supremacy movement by a scholar named Kathleen Ballou, called "Bring the War Home." And so she does a really fine job explaining how basically a huge number of disaffected men who felt like their government had lost the war and had screwed them over became susceptible to this sort of white supremacist ideology, and they entered this movement with a lot of combat experience. And so Louis Beam wasn't sort of a theoretical threat. He was a very real threat, but also he, shortly before the events of this book started, he had been trying to kind of live this double life of, I think he was working with some engineering company or some contractor or something, and he would be a Klansman, on the weekends. But when one of his paramilitary camps was discovered, they were basically training Boy Scouts how to decapitate people and how to fire AK-47s, and that made I think the front page of the New York Times in the late 70s. And there were a lot of Texan moms who were quite upset that they thought they were sending their boys away to like a fun weekend camp, and they came back having trained with Klansmen.
Mm-hmm.
But he kept losing his job, and he basically turned full time to Klan work. But in order for this to work, he needed dues-paying members, and the only real way to do this was through media attention and to raise his profile. But this will sound kind of like I'm saying it tongue in cheek, but I think the media had gotten a little tired of like going out and taking pictures or footage of 10 scraggly dudes in a lawn somewhere burning a cross. And so when he went down to Seadrift to, threaten this fact-finding mission about what went wrong with the killing of Billy Joe Applin, and found himself lavished with media attention, the way I describe it in the book, it's almost like a proof of concept. Like he's got that test led to, shortly after he went down there, a new Klan chapter started in Seadrift, and its members were sworn in at a dock owned by relatives. They were owned by Applins, and so he was kind of waiting for another opportunity to make hay out of this issue. And so when things started sort of percolating up in Galveston Bay a year and a half later, he was quite ready and had a whole plan of attack. He called this guerrilla theater.
A much bigger media market. Much bigger. We've got a couple of remarks from Cheryl Carey about Diane Wilson. What an incredible woman. How old is she now? I believe she's around 75, but she has not slowed down. She is really still very active. And a lot of her story is in this book. It's really great. The thing that surprised me, I think, when I talked to you briefly last year when I reviewed her book, was you said that you had been able to reach out to Louis Beam and he answered questions via email, if I recall that correctly. And also a little bit alarming to me was that he apparently has returned after many years in the Northwest to living in Texas. And I kind of not sure I would want to know what he's doing here, but is that still the case? And
yeah, that's my understanding is that he's still there.
New Braunfels area, I believe.
Yes, exactly. I was searching for that. I knew it was a German name. But he he maintains a website which is full of all kinds of screeds and hateful articles. I sent him I think I took probably a few emails before he asking him to talk before he agreed to. I was quite ready to interview him in person, but he, for some reason, never, I guess, felt comfortable enough speaking with me about this face to face. But he did answer questions, although I don't think he's had any kind of great sort of moments of reform or anything like that. I mean, he's what he told me was that this was all kind of misunderstood, that it was really a fight against the government. It had nothing to do with the Vietnamese. It was about economic issues. And I also have Vietnamese friends.
Yeah, he's still spinning us, right? I mean, he's still a PR guy.
But it's also, there are so many white fishermen that participated in the events of this book who to this day would say to me, this was not about the Vietnamese, this wasn't racism, this was about economics. We were protecting our way of life. And I tried my best to paint how dire the economic situation was for these fishermen back then. But you can't roll around on boats in Klan robes, chanting white power. There were rallies where 700 or 800 people were chanting white power and making very explicit threats against the Vietnamese. You can't do all of that and then say, oh, sorry, it has nothing to do with race.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult. I know some people even said that where you had pictures of them burning crosses in Vietnamese people's yards. You alluded to this. There are some really great books, and then there is a wonderful documentary, Sea Drift by Tim Sy, who's I believe when he was doing it, was a student at the University of Texas at Austin, and he also found some film that I believe you were able to view that was taken way back in the 80s or in the late 70s. But one of the things that's really also rich in the book is that the Vietnamese characters are very, very complex and very interesting. And you told me, and I think I might have misspelled Father John's name, so please correct that, but that Father John was actually someone who was really key for you into getting to speak to some of the members of the Vietnamese fishing community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can't help but smile whenever I see his picture. And it's Father John Tuan Minh Nguyen. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it.
Yeah, I think that it should have been a T on instead of a J. There's apologies to Father John.
But so I kept reading and hearing about this. He was a Vietnamese priest. I mean, this is lost, I think, on a lot of people, but the overwhelming majority of the first waves of Vietnamese refugees were Catholics. And so he was running a parish in Kima, if I believe. It was either Kima or Seabrook. And he had a pretty harrowing account himself of he had received threats. He was hiding Vietnamese parishioners in his church at one point, telling them that the Klansmen would have to basically kill him before they got to his parishioners. He told me that he would frequently be called out to a parishioner's home, and in more than one occasions there was a dead cat hanging from a noose in front of the homes of his parishioners. And a lot of the Vietnamese were quite nervous to talk to local law enforcement about what they were going through, because they were worried about whether they could trust them or not. And this might, seem like, overwrought, but I mean, that I found all kinds of photos of Galveston sheriffs riding around with Klan hoods on. Houston police. There's a famous photo series of Houston and Galveston police going on night rides in their squad cars, but wearing Klan regalia.
Yeah, and there is no official HPD record of a investigation that was requested into those men. And the other thing is, Louis Beam was arrested along with some other people, or detained after setting fire to Houston Pacifica's radio station. He was not even wearing a mask, and he was let go. And there was a period where Houston, right around then, that Houston's police department was still overseen by a man who was very much a throwback to Jim Crow days. And he was accused by a lot of the civil rights activists of protecting Klan members within the HPD. But as far as I could tell, and I've looked into this myself, there's never been anything released on who were the night riders who were riding around in their uniforms, who were HPD officers or Pasadena officers, even into the 80s or late 70s.
I looked into it myself and also couldn't find anything. I did find one article where Beam basically said something to the effect that the mayor's brother or something was an active member of the Klan, and so there was a sort of
there was a mayor named Welch who was, it's said to be his brother. One of his family members was said to be a KKK member, and the chief at the time defended the officers who were wearing their Klan uniforms in the press. It's hard to believe that was happening still in the late 70s. There's a question by Kristen Stewart. Kristen, tell me who you were thinking of. How honest were the answers you think? You're thinking of the answers that former KKK members were given, or answers that who were you thinking? I'm sorry, I missed that question when you posted it. I wonder. Louis Beam, how honest were Louis's answers? I think.
Oh, I
halfway answered that as very much spin, right? But
yeah, no, I don't think he's. He tried to suggest that he was not only pro-Vietnamese, but that he was part of a plan that was going to go back to Vietnam and basically win the war. This is after the fall of Saigon. So I mean, it's kind of fantasy land, but no, but as an investigative journalist, I have some obligation to put the questions to him. I also had hundreds of pages of his statements from back then, his statements in court under oath, and so there's a fair amount of. I mean, you get to know somebody fairly well when you spend that much time sort of combing through these court documents. But there was one thing I wanted to mention briefly on Father John. I could not find the priest. I think it took 2+ years, and then I was tipped off that he was still alive and that he was living in a priest retirement home in Houston. And so I flew down and had a kind of, incredible series of interviews with him. He's, at the time of our interview, I think he was maybe 80 or 81. And at one point I said to him, I'm having a difficult time because frankly, a lot of the Klansmen or the Klan allies, it's easier to get them to talk to me than the Vietnamese who suffered the sort of the campaign of violence and intimidation. And he said, well, who do you want to talk to? And I gave a few names, and he's like, all right, well, let's get in your car. So he got into the passenger seat, and he just was pointing, like, turn straight. There was the guy doesn't have a smartphone or anything. And then we'd pull into some neighborhood and he'd say, stop, wait here. And then he'd kind of hurry up to the front door, ring the bell. And I would see this elderly Vietnamese couple talking with the priest. They're happy to see their priest. And then after a few minutes, Father John would wave me over and he would tell the couple, the parishioners, this is Kirk, talk to him, tell him your stories. And it worked. It helped in a huge way, just to kind of break the ice, because I wish I could speak Vietnamese. There's a huge, I just know from other times in my life what a role having sort of some language fluency can play in breaking down some of these walls. But I remember joking with my wife that man, I want and need a priest in every investigation now moving forward. They're useful allies.
Your priest ally.
Yeah.
But of course, you have experience. I don't know that you've ever been to Vietnam, but you have lived in war zones. You have seen people who were fresh out of combat. You mentioned at the very beginning, your dad was a Vietnam War veteran. So you had, I think, maybe more than average Americans, some common ground, some things you could share with people to break the ice. I wondered if that was a factor in your really incredible portrait of Colonel Nam Van Nguyen of Seabrook, who is really one of the big heroes of the book. He's the person who stands up as the leader of the community. He sort of stuck with that, whether he wants to be the leader of the community or not, because he was a pretty big leader in the South Vietnamese army, and his community looks to him for leadership, even though he knows, as you recount, very little about shrimping, sort of gets into it by accident. You tell not only his story, but the story of a lot of his family members. Again, there's a rich sort of familial portrait in each of your characters. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to know Colonel Nguyen and that story of that family?
Yeah, I mean, he is a heroic guy. He fought for 22 years in Vietnam, was shot, wounded on multiple occasions, and was planning on fighting to the death, fighting the North Vietnamese to the death. He had shaved his head in preparation for the kind of final battle, and he had sent his wife and children off, and in the final hours when he was bringing his, I think he was bringing his parents, if I recall, or one of his parents, down to one of the last boats in Saigon. They basically pulled him into the boat with him as the boat was taking off, and they're like, "You're not. It's over. The war is lost. We're out of here." And so he lands in Texas, San Antonio first, where I think he worked for many years as a gas station attendant as an Exxon, filling up people's tanks and things like that, washing their windshields. But he kept saving up all of his money, and he bought himself a pretty dilapidated fish house in Seabrook, and he had this kind of fantasy of having a peaceful life on the water's edge, just buying and selling shrimp. And almost as soon as he got there, this conflict started with the Klan, and the South Vietnamese. They all knew who he was. He had commanded thousands of men at the peak of the war, and they basically, conscripted him and said, "You're our leader." And he really, tried for the better part of a year to absorb the wrath from white shrimpers that were blaming him and blaming all of their woes on Colonel Nam and the other Vietnamese. But he started getting death threats. His home was shot at. He started to have to maintain a network of safe houses throughout Kemah and Seabrook, where he would keep his own son was hiding in a safe house that had no electricity, doing his homework by candlelight because he was worried that the Klan was going to find them. And it really wasn't. When the Klan boat patrol, the main destination of that boat patrol was Colonel Nam's fish house, where
Colonel Nam at the time had that little baby that you see in the slide, little baby daughter.
That's right, and she was being babysat by I think his niece, and she looked out the window and saw this boat with a bunch of heavily armed Klansmen pointing up to her, and she ran out into the street in Seabrook, terrified, as she never wanted to go back there after that. And so Colonel Nam basically organized the Vietnamese into the Vietnamese Fishermen's Coalition, and basically got them to put their trust in a document in the Constitution of the United States, and in a plan with the help from this lawyer from the Southern Poverty Law Center, Morris Dees, but to basically say, we're not gonna shoot them if they shoot at us. We're not gonna meet violence with violence. We're gonna ask the federal government.
We don't want to give away the end of the book, but I have to say that this book has a lot of positive endings. If you know your history, you do know what happened. but it's a very dramatic book, and there's a lot of different, as we say, complex characters who come together. And it's just, that's Gulf Coast Texas, right, where there's a lot of complex, diverse characters on the coast. And fortunately for you, many of them are good storytellers, and you manage to get them talking, which is no small thing. I know we're right about at the hour mark. Some other people have questions. We've just been having fun talking. We've gone a little bit longer than I had planned to in our portion. There are a couple more questions I have for Kirk about his other books, but I'd love to hear it from you. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. You could put them here in the chat, or you can put them on Facebook, and I will hear about them from our lovely Harris County Library staff. But this is a wonderful program. Take advantage of the opportunity you have to ask Kirk any crazy question you have. I wanted to mention a little bit about some of his other books. His previous book also was born of fly fishing, The Feather Thief. And it is actually even more related to fly fishing. We heard about how really it was fly fishing and Bruce that got Kirk on the track of this Galveston Kemah, really a Kemah story. But this book is about somebody who literally carried out a major heist of a natural history museum, stealing dead birds to, I kid you not, build some of those flies. And sort of it's an amazing tale of, I think, obsession as much as of crime of a young man, also very complicated character. Also is a secondary character who happens to be Vietnamese. Again, this is an interesting book that delves beneath the surface of something that might seem just like a crazy news story, but really it has some other global considerations. And what is the value of our environment? What is the value of our birds and our wildlife? Just as you raise these larger issues in your most recent book, The Fisherman and the Dragon, you raised them in The Feather Thief. You're looking at the birds of the air instead of the creatures of the sea. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about The Feather Thief. And I understand there's potentially a TV deal or movie deal in the offing.
Yeah, it's being turned into a TV series, a limited series. Yeah, honestly, that book was it's a pretty astonishing story. It's true. It happened. It was a multi-year investigation, but this was the biggest natural history heist ever, of about $1 million worth of these exotic birds, stolen to feed this sort of obsessive community of Victorian salmon fly tyers. It was all completely bizarre and new to me, but that was the appeal to it, because until that point, I was 8 or 9 years into a kind of long battle with the U.S. government on behalf of my Iraqi colleagues. I lost several of my Iraqi colleagues to assassination because they were seen as traitors for working alongside the U.S. as interpreters for our troops and for our Marines. And it was an exhausting battle. I had my organization got thousands out, but as you said at the top, there were, I'm kind of haunted by all those that I didn't get out. But The Feather Thief was a kind of, I don't know, like an escape for me to just try to do something else, just to get away from the war. And in some ways, Fisherman and the Dragon was a way for me to, I don't know, braid the two, because it's about war and refugees. It's also about our relationship to the natural resources and to the natural world. But but it's also about fishermen, so they're kind of bound together. But yeah, it's funny seeing all three of these books next to each other, because you wouldn't think there's a direct through line, and there's no plan or master strategy behind any of this.
just the way your mind works, apparently. Lindsay Waite is saying, I found your book a highly educational and exceptionally well written. Are you currently working on a new research and writing project? I think she's asking about books, but I know you have some other TV projects. Do you have another book?
Yeah, I'm actually doing the adaptation of The Feather Thief for Universal. So I've been writing that script. I'm also I was involved in pretty intensely in efforts to get U.S. affiliated Afghans out as Kabul was falling, and I had a role in getting quite a few children out whose parents had been killed because they worked for us. And one of those stories, I've been asked to turn that into a movie script. I don't know if that will happen or not, but and in terms of books, I have at any point in time, I have 4, 5, 6 different lines in the water.
Fishing.
Yeah, but these are very, I mean, The Fisherman and the Dragon was maybe a 4 or 5 year effort. There's a guy who might be a mastermind behind one of the biggest diamond heists in U.S. history, but he's in prison right now, and I'm trying to get. I'm in a year-long, snail mail exchange with him to try to get him to open up, and he has zero incentive to talk to me, but he keeps replying. So there are a bunch happening, but I've started to become a little. I'm not a superstitious person, but if I know what the next book is, I tend to kind of clam up about it.
Yep, I got you. I understand. Gets superstitious a little bit. There's the Fisherman again. And I think the other thing you've said, and we talked about this at the top, is that in some ways fishing is kind of a therapy for you, and I think some ways, at least The Feather Thief was sort of therapy for you, because I believe your first book, you were in a way maybe re-traumatizing yourself by writing about what you had experienced and trying to save people and not be able to save people. And I haven't read your first book yet, but I will read it. That kind of work is extremely difficult. I know. Do you feel like these books have helped you heal? I know that also simultaneously you had met your wife, Marie-Josée, who I believe is an attorney, you said, and I hope I pronounced her name correctly.
And this book, The Fisherman and the Dragon, wouldn't exist without her, because I started investigating in earnest in 2019, early 2019, and then I started writing it just as the pandemic started. And at the time, I think my son was 4 and my daughter was 3. And, they were home from school, and these are not the most conducive conditions to writing a book. And so I had to, and also I wanted to, spend time with them. I've never been one of these authors that can kind of just lock my door. And so I, for the first maybe year and a half of the pandemic, I would write from 8:30 p.m. until 4:30 in the morning, because it was the only quiet time in the house. And I would collapse into bed, and my wife would she would handle the mornings. She would come up with activities for the kids to do. She was teaching them when the schools were shut. And I was a pretty, useless husband and father for the first stage while I was writing it. But, anytime you meet an author and if they don't acknowledge what a group effort all of these undertakings are, then they've got to be kind of a jerk because I'm fully aware of how indebted I am to her and to others just for even telling me their stories. But yeah, but I do feel very fortunate to have these stories and to have them to live on, and also particularly with Fisherman because I think I got this story just in the nick of time. If I had discovered this a year later, if I had heard that Springsteen song a year later, I think huge portions of the story would have been lost when people like Jody and David Collins passed during the pandemic. And so anyway, I just hope I do justice to the complexity of this issue. But yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
I think no, but that's all right. I think we're probably around the time we were gonna, maybe even over the time we said we were gonna talk. But just wanted to give another shout out to anyone who might want to have one last question. I really do want to recommend the 2 books I've already read, and I fully intend to read Kirk's 3rd book. They're extremely well written books, but they're also investigative journalism books. The Feather Thief, he puts himself in a little bit more first person investigation. This book, he goes into the minds of a lot of very interesting Texans we've discussed, and they're really fun books to read. So I hope you will read them and enjoy them in the Harris County book clubs, and support your local libraries and Texas authors. And Kirk will just adopt you as a visiting sometime Texan. How about that?
Well, thank you, and Lisa, thank you for doing this, and also I just want to repeat my gratitude to Celeste and the whole Gulf Coast Reads program, but also to all of you who read the book. This is not like beach reading. It's full of really colorful and kind of shocking stories, but like you have to have a stomach for it. And so I cannot thank people enough for I guess honoring me by giving me that time and reading the book. It means a lot. So thank you.
Well, I think it's a history book, but it's also a history that's very relevant right now, Celeste, I think. So a great choice by Gulf Coast Reads.
Yes, it really was. Thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great conversation. Thank you again, Lisa, for moderating for us. You can find out more about Lise Olsen's work online, and her little kitty, hello. And Kirk, for taking the time out of your day to tell us more about this incredible story that you wrote in The Fisherman and the Dragon. And I repeat what someone said here in the chat. Thank you for the work you have done, and what an incredible kitty, and enjoyed the book immensely. Thank you, Gulf Coast Reads. So thank you guys again. For all of you listening out there, you can check out the book at your local library if you've yet to read it, or buy it wherever books are sold. You can also view a great timeline created by our archivist Lainey on our site. It is archives.hcpl.net/gulf-coast-reads. I also put it here in the chat if you would like to look at it later. Again, to find out more about Gulf Coast Reads or to join the committee, please visit us at gulfcoastreads.org. Thank you again so much for spending your evening with us, and have a good night. Goodbye.